It's called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, but it's actually about a unique form of domestic terrorism that's one of the ugliest parts of American history. The target of that terror, Black Americans. We're talking about lynchings. The memorial opened today in Montgomery, Alabama. It features striking sculptures and haunting stories. Those stories are emphasized by a stunning array of hanging metal monuments. Too many Americans have no idea more than 4,400 people were tortured and hung from trees, electric poles, and even street signs as a form of intimidation to communities. Now, those murders went well into the 20th century. More often than not, the killers were applauded, not jailed. Now, Pastor Kathy McFadden says visitors cannot be untouched by what they see.
They have mixed feelings. Some are not sure they want to see it. Others are not sure how they're going to feel once they see it. And so it's going to bring up some emotional issues as we relive a part of our history that was and is very painful.
My father was Elmore Bowling, and he died from being shot 6 times with a pistol and once in the back with a shotgun. It hurts mostly because of the reason he was killed, and that was because he was ambitious, he helped others, and he had acquired a good sum of money for making a living. I am very impressed with the memorial and impressed with the gentleman, Brian Stevenson, who has come up with this idea. We have not been acknowledged, my family, as victims of a lynching, and this is the first opportunity that we'll have that someone will actually acknowledge the terrorism that we faced. And I believe that's going to be important for the masses of people that will be recognized in the over 4,000 lynchings that he's captured to place in this memorial. So it's important that the people to whom the injustices have been given are actually being recognized, and at least some measure of relief is sought through discussion. And one of the other things is that we're hoping that it will serve to make America better in terms of race relations.
Earlier, I spoke with Tanisha Ford. She's an historian at the University of Delaware. When we look at lynching in America, it was a crucial tool of terrorism that was used by some people. Can you put it into historic context for us?
You know, when I think about the legacy of lynching in this country, I can't think about this history without resting on Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was an incredible crusader in the anti-lynching campaign. And Ida B. Wells Barnett was one of the first people to bring it to the attention of all Americans that lynching was a violent, inhumane form of punishment and terror that really had no grounds in this country, right? So oftentimes when we think of lynching, we think of it as some sort of punishment for a crime. But Ida B. Wells Barnett helped us to understand that really that this was a way for white Americans to maintain the trenches of white supremacy through racialized terror.
So it wasn't just an action against a single person, because it was designed to send a message. It was so public and so horrific. I mean, people often think that it's just you're hanging someone, but it was much, much worse than that.
It was much, much worse than that. So if we think about this period of Reconstruction, the country is trying to rebuild itself after the Civil War. And now you have millions of freed African-American people who were once enslaved, and social order is now in flux. And so groups of white people across the country, but primarily in the South when we think about lynching, would use this as a form of terror to uphold their status in the society. So if we could accuse a black man of raping a white woman or of stealing, then, you know, lynching became a justification for that action. But really what we know is that they didn't even have to have a rationale for this. And it meant that all black people lived under terror. When you left your home, you didn't know if you would come back. Your loved ones didn't know if you would come back. And you're right, it was more than just this act of hanging someone. That was often part of it, but it also involved castration, burning and mutilating the body, removing parts of the body, and this was oftentimes done in front of a public audience.
So when we look at that, was this audience often white people? We see those images of folks gathering for what appears from the outside as a carnival, and as a black man it's difficult for me to see it in that perspective. But were there twin messages being sent out, to one to white audiences and another to black audiences?
Indeed. So oftentimes when we see pictures of lynchings, we can see black people being the center of the focus in terms of the violence enacted against their bodies. But then there's also a crowd of white spectators, which oftentimes included young children. And so on one hand, it's signaling that white people have complete control over black bodies, but also that we're raising up the next generation of children who would understand this as a norm. For African Americans, again, it was a sign of the devaluation of our bodies. It was a marker that white people saw us as unhuman, you know, and that we were in many ways still living under a system of enslavement, to the point where our bodies were still under the control of white folks.
When we look at the black body, it's played an extraordinary role in the development of really all the Americas, but in particular we look at the United States, where we have monuments like, you know, the White House and countless others that were built by black people whose value was diminished. And yet we have lynchings in particular. The role of lynching in America as a symbol, as a lens through which to look at history, how significant is it? Because we know this museum is opening up. How significant is that lens?
This is a very important lens, because this is a history that hasn't been told largely for a public audience. So this new museum, the Legacy Museum, which has two components, it's a museum, but then it's also a memorial for the people who have lost their life to violence related to lynching. And yes, it becomes a way to tell a history of a people, one that pulls back a layer of like this rosy, romantic time in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, where, you know, we were rebuilding after the Civil War, and it tells a much more complicated, much more harrowing history of the violence that African Americans endured just to try to make an equal wage, just to try to create safe environments for their families. And the museum uses some of the most modern technology to recreate that history, to drop us right in the center of a building that was once used as a slave market, and to then recreate the narratives of formerly enslaved African Americans, and then to guide us through the period of enslavement into this nadir of American history, where lynchings were an everyday occurrence, to recreate the stories of the more than 4,000 African Americans.
Well, I want to stop you for a second. You said more than 4,000, because oftentimes people don't believe it's that many, but we're talking about thousands of people, Americans, who were lynched in this stream of terror that went through the country.
Exactly.
Including women, not just men.
Not just men, including women. And 4,000, that's just the records that they could uncover. Because remember, this was often a clandestine act, a vigilante act. So there were, I would assume, thousands more of people who were lynched whose records we don't have, you know, whose bodies were just gone. And we don't have a public record to commemorate it. But this museum becomes one step towards telling that history and making that history visible.
What does it say about us today that we're looking at American history through this extraordinarily painful and shameful lens?
Well, we continue to see this pain today, and that's what the museum does. It takes us up through the present moment, including the recent incidents at the Starbucks in Philadelphia, right? That this museum is a social justice oriented museum that sees lynching as part of this longer legacy of anti-racist action and activism on the part of African Americans, but it also uses that same lens to discuss a lot of the issues that continue to plague us today that groups like the Black Lives Matter activists are addressing.
If you could connect the dots for me a little bit from the legacy of lynching to policy today, and even, the role that law enforcement may have in this, connect those dots for me.
Well, I think, again, Ida B. Wells was our best teacher in this because she made it clear that if we did not do something in the late 19th century to eradicate lynching, that this would be an illness that would fester it well into the 20th century, and she was right.
You think it has festered today, the Black Lives Matter movement? Is it a reaction to the forces that led to lynching and then evolved until today?
Well, what we can see is that lynching and the anti-lynching campaign that Ida B. Wells Barnett enacted that tried to bring attention to this movement before we were so deeply entrenched in segregation. So what Ida B. Wells Barnett foreshadowed for us was the reality that if we didn't do something about lynching, that this would be a sickness that festered well into the 20th century. And we could see how Jim Crow segregation took hold in this country in the early 20th century, and how we see the legacy of that legal segregation even today. And yes, I do think organizations like Black Lives Matter are fighting against a much longer history and tradition of violence against African Americans.
Thank you so much, Associate Professor Tanisha Ford of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching Arise America. We'll be right back.